This is a lecture, it's a variation of a lecture. For about a dozen years, I've been presenting a story of my experiences at the Karaton Surakarta in the early 90s. And I've been presenting it to a group of, in the context of architecture students studying historic preservation. So in each of those presentations, I've never given the same version twice. I'm always pushing the boundaries, always pushing my audience to go with me a little deeper within the limitations of an undergraduate architecture curriculum. And I'm really excited to have a different audience this time, because I'm going to push in ways that I always wanted to push, but never really could previously. So with your indulgence, here it is, the Kraton Surakarta. The themes, it's a little bit autobiography, and then a little bit anthropology, and a bit of architectural preservation, and an awful lot about how I thought it was all about buildings. It turned out to be less about the buildings and more about what happens within and between the buildings. The buildings themselves are really just an empty shell. It's the performance practice, the rituals that renew and restore and reproduce and extend the meaning of the buildings. Without those ritual practices, the buildings are really nothing. And so that's my preface, my thesis statement, perhaps. So the autobiographical part, I was a typical architecture student.
Hey, Robert, just a second, I'm sorry. It looks
Sure.
like your PowerPoint may have minimized. I think I see your desktop. It looks like a brutalist structure.
The brutalist structure is the content.
Okay, just making sure. Sorry.
Yeah, so the preamble, I should be showing that, the aerial view of the Kraton. The first part of it is autobiographical in that I was a typical architecture student with typical architecture student concerns about, wow, buildings are cool. And I was in the third year of my 5-year professional training when I studied in great depth Lucan's Salk Institute in La Jolla, California. I was obsessed with the building, the beautiful use of teak, contrasted with the concrete. And I was obsessed with the building. I had a long experience with engineering prior to architecture. So I was obsessed with the innovative structural trusses, the incorporation of systems. And then something very bizarre happened. Something snapped in my brain. And all of a sudden, I realized that the value and the richness and the wonderfulness of this building had really nothing to do, or very little to do, with the building itself. It was the spatial framing that the building produced, this view off to the sunset of the Pacific Ocean with this line, this trough of water. And so it was a kind of a transformative moment that sent me on a journey looking at the spaces between buildings, the spaces within buildings, and the relationship between spaces outside and spaces inside. This is a famous map from 1756 of Rome, where the public spaces of the interiors of famous churches are available in the way this is drawn. Another strange thing happened. My girlfriend at the time, who was a career pianist practicing 5, 6, 7 hours a day, heading on a path towards a glorious career as a pianist, she came home one day and decided to, she announced, I'm done. She really was done in retrospect. She dropped piano and started searching. She played Japanese flute, Ghanaian drumming, a bunch of different things. And then she started playing this weird stuff called gamelan from a weird place called Java. And she went off to Solo and studied one summer and sent back this photograph in an envelope in what we used to call mail. And this photograph I found very intriguing. It came with a story that this gate building is the threshold into a garden enclave of a noble's house, Joyokusuman. Many of you have been there, in the midst of a very densely packed neighborhood. So you go from this very tightly packed urban situation through this building, opening up into a garden. I was so amazed. Even though I studied Italian for a year, was ready to go to Rome, I dropped everything. I started applying for grants to spend some time in Indonesia. I went to the New York Public Library and basically took everything that they had about Indonesia and Javanese architecture, which amounted to this one single book, which I read cover to cover, and basically arrived. I eventually got a grant for 3 months. I arrived knowing nothing except what I could find in books. Very high population densities. 1/2 the world's population lives in this depiction of the world. And Java itself is one of the highest population densities, in part because of the volcanic rich soils and this rich architectural heritage that is dead, 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 and gone. Looking at Jakarta didn't help much. The very simple reading of Jakarta is a city of villages that was slowly, the urban villages the kampung were being displaced by mid-rise and then high-rise development. And the first complication came in trying to understand this thing, this Monas, which is apparently in the midst of a 92% Muslim majority country, a symbol of the Lengga Nyoni from Hinduism. And the interplay of religions was the first sense of a pretty significant complication and complexity. In the background, there's the Protestant church, then the mosque, and then this Hindu Javanese symbol of the nation state. Arriving in Solo, it was useful that Joyokusuman was still kos, so I spent a few nights in there. The first morning I woke up at the gate, this gate. I asked the Becak driver, so what's the deal with this gate? And what's the deal with this house? And he explained, well, it's a replica, in miniature of the palace. And I said, palace? There's a palace? I knew nothing. And he said, yeah, go around, go to the end, turn right, go to the end of that, turn right again, ask someone, you'll find it. So I arrived at the front gate of the palace. There was a guard there. And I said, is this the palace? And he said, yeah, it's the palace. He said, there's a museum. If you go around there, you can go to the museum. It's a popular tourist destination. And so, of course, through my ignorant view, having learned nothing prior to arriving, sure, it used to be a palace and now it's a museum. But then as I was about to depart, the guard simbad to a carload of people who disembarked and went through the gate. And I said, who's that? And he said, oh, that's the princess. And I said, princess? And he said, yeah, princess. I said, there's a princess? He said, there are 36 princes and princesses. 36? And he said, yes, the king has 6 wives and he has 36 children. And by now I'm starting to catch on that and there might be something a bit more going on here. Upon entering the palace, and which I did day after day for the next few weeks, I continuously marveled at the fact that the buildings were not in very good shape. It was pretty startling. And at the same time, there seemed to be a lot of activity going on. And as I got to know the royal members of the royal family, eventually got a chance to talk to the Sinuhun, and participate and witness for myself some of the ongoing ceremonies. I started to catch on that there was a lot going on in this palace. It wasn't just a museum, that there was a royal family and some kind of series of religious practices that were still going on. And in the midst of that, there was a somewhat awkward, some would say bizarre, mixing of cultures. And I came to learn a term called syncretism, where previous religious beliefs or cultural practices would encounter the importation or the imposition of new cultural practices, new belief systems from outside. And instead of one simply displacing the other or the original one rejecting any input from the outside, something else is possible. Something else would happen, that the most attractive attributes of the newly arriving culture or practice would be embraced and dijawakan, Javanized, acculturated into the pre-existing framework and made Javanese. So here you see the Ottoman fez, the Dutch brass band, the Baroque pediment, the tails coat of the tuxedo that became part of the costume, famously as told by John Pemberton. The tails, there was an event where both the Dutch Governor General was going to be present, and the Sinuhun from the Kraton. So Prince Mangkunagoro told his dresser, well, I have to wear proper Dutch attire. The resident will be there, but I have to wear proper Javanese attire. The Sinuhun will be there. Let's put them together. And when they put the tails coat on top of the sarong with the short sword, the kris caused the tails to pop up and back. And they both agreed, the dresser and Mangkunagoro agreed, this will simply not do. The dresser took out his shears and snipped off the tails, and voila, history was made. This is now, until the present, the proper formal attire, which is a complete hybrid formation between the Dutch tails coat and the sarong with the kris. This obviously Baroque Dutch gift from Queen Wilhelmina to the Sinuhun in Solo was simply a relic of Dutch culture when it arrived, but over the course of weeks, months, years, and decades has accumulated a sense of sacredness. And every Wednesday evening, an offering is placed at the base of the carriage, because the carriage itself has become a talisman with great authority and power within the context of the Kajawan practice religion. And so, unpacking some of the layers of this, the pre-Hindu animist belief system, including the Queen of the South Seas, is something that has been an armature around which everything else has accumulated. To the present, it is still acknowledged as a piece of religious practice and beliefs widely held that requires commemoration through a cycle of rituals. Added to that, when in the first centuries AD, when trade across the Indian Ocean put the Javanese in touch with the subcontinent of South Asia, the Hindu religious system was not only embraced, it was celebrated and amplified and became, as you all know, part of the Mahabharata, Ramayana, Wyoming stories, completely and totally Javanized. And the Hindu Javanese cosmological model of the universe is something that was embraced and made the basis of the design of cities, of sacred royal cities of the Mataram dynasty. And so in this Tibetan coin, we see the rectilinear interpretation of this otherwise circular cosmological geometry, three-dimensional geometry, and interpreting it, taking some artistic license, these concentric circles of continents and oceans, of 7 continents, 7 oceans, beyond which the great, vast, infinite waves of the vast nothingness, the seas beyond the final continent. And it became an orthogonal version of this model. And so the Kraton is a piece of urban form that is a replica in miniature of the Hindu Javanese cosmological model. And it's not just a symbol, it's not just a symbolic representation of this cosmological model. It is actually a sacred instrument of power that is deployed through the regular performance of rituals in seeking the balance and rebalance of the between heaven and earth. And at the center of this cosmological model, at the Karaton, the center of the Kraton, is the umbilical cord between the cosmological mother of the heavens and the realm on the earth of humans. And so all good fortune flows from heaven to earth through the umbilical cord, through the belly button of the world, which is the central pendopo of the Kraton. And then out from that center, it flows in concentric circles of sacredness, which requires us, as we come closer and closer to Solo, we must use High Javanese. As we come closer and closer to the Kraton, we must dress properly. As we enter each gateway and becoming closer and closer to the center, we must look to the left mirror to make sure our outer appearance is proper, and then the mirror on the right of each portal to inspect our inner state to make sure we are prepared in our inner spirit to enter the next level. Shoes come off, the samir, the red and gold ribbon, must be worn to indicate to the Queen of the South Seas that you are an ally, friend, or family member of the Sinunung. And so the physical reality of this palace complex is informed throughout by these this function, this larger purpose of the palace as not just a symbol of the cosmological order, but as an instrument for the constant adjustment and adaptation to restore any imbalance, correct any imbalances that might occur. Two of the Sinunung's advisors meditated in a cave several hundred years ago, and when their grandson came to bring them food, he found 2 blankets covering their forms in the cave. And when he pulled back the blankets, he found 2 cannon. One cannon is in Jakarta, and the other cannon is here in the Kraton and Solo. Only the priest who cleans the cannon 3 times a year and the Sinunung himself are allowed to set eyes on the cannon. So here's a ceremony in which the priest cleans the cannon, the water cleans the cannon inside and out, the pavilion that the cannon sits in is cleaned, and the pendopo, the joglo roof that shelters the pavilion is cleaned. And the abdi dalam, the volunteers, the servants of the Sinuhun squeegee the water off, and then in a frantic pushing and shoving, the old women scramble to compete with each other to fill their plastic water bottles with the dirty water that comes off of the kraton of this building. And so here I am slowly catching on that this isn't just a museum, it's not just a royal family. The people actually buy this story, and there are believers, there are still believers. And then we come to the Grebek Maulud, a Islamic holiday that uses the symbols of the Lingga and Yoni and the nation state of Indonesia. So on the left is the Lingga, on the right is the Yoni, and this ceremony has been cyclically performed with great fidelity every year over the centuries. And it's paraded from the inside of the palace out to the right, to the north, along the ceremonial axis, out during Sekaten, out into the Alun-Alun Lor, the northern open square of the palace, symbolizing Alun-Alun means waves. And so this is the infinite sea that lies beyond the seventh continent. And then taking a turn towards the west, entering the grand mosque of Surakarta during Sekaten. I believe there was a lecture about Sekaten. And so after the appropriate prayers, these offerings are brought out in front of the mosque where it is summarily ripped apart. So I'm told I should give the URL when I play video.
Ya, tapi ternyata bisa sampai sekarang bisa agak selamat dari bahaya keruntuhan. Semua itu kalau kita bisa menghargai dan kita bisa narimo apa kita itu.
So at various points I'm playing excerpts from a film made by a friend of mine who became very close with Pakubuwana XII before his death. And it's an excellent documentation in video of many of the performing arts that play such a vital role in this restoring the balance between heaven and earth. A big one is Malam Satu Soro, that very explicitly the seers of the palace look at what happened in the previous year, forecast what they anticipate happening in the next year, and based on the imbalance demonstrated in the previous year and the catastrophes that they must now attempt to head off in the coming year, they select specific talismans of the Kraton to parade around the Kraton in the Malam Satu Soro, the Javanese New Year, Kirap Pusaka. Pusaka are these sacred objects. And so these objects have to be concealed so as not to create a panic. If people see the object associated with a volcanic eruption, it might cause some anxiety. And this, in a way, was the most startling revelation of how seriously people still took the Kajawan religion and the role of the Kraton and the Sinuhun in it in the 90s, was the thousands of people that would walk in from the surrounding villages and line the streets in throngs as the pusaka are paraded behind the white buffalo.
Juga kita lempar untuk menjadi uang untuk membiayai ulang tahun kenaikan takhta, ulang tahun grebek-grebek dan sebagainya.
And so the white buffalo know when to come into Solo, and they know when to gallop forward, they know when to stop, and we all just followed along. And when the buffalo would relieve themselves on the streets, people would break ranks and snatch up, the urine would be wiped up with sarongs, taken home. The excrement would be scooped up in baskets and taken home because, of course, everything is sacred. You put it in the rice fields to ensure a bountiful harvest. And finally, I think one of the most interesting of the ceremonies is the coronation, the Jumenengan Dalam, the anniversary of the coronation of the king.
Upacara sampai bisa bertahan.
This is the Panggung Songobuono, the tower devoted to the Queen of the South Seas. Every year on the anniversary of the coronation, the Sinuhun ascends the stairs amongst the offerings, and he renews the conjugal union with the Queen of the South Seas in the upper chamber of the Panggung Songobuono. And so this tower is one of the most exclusive. People don't go up there. It's just a priest, the king, that's it. And the famous Bedoyo Ketawang dance is part of that tradition as well, that it's performed every month, every Javanese month in the evening. It's rehearsed, and then the night before the coronation, it's rehearsed again. And there's a lot of really interesting beliefs and supernatural stories associated with the Bedoyo Ketawang. The next part of the presentation looks at some of the struggles the Kraton has undergone since 1949 in Indonesian independence. The Kraton has suffered an expropriation of all its land holdings. There was a judgment. Many in Solo especially would say it was a misjudgment that the Karaton Surakarta was insufficiently supportive of the war for independence. Jogja was elevated, Hamengkubuwono became the vice president, and Surakarta was demoted and became subordinate. It had to, from that point forward, it had to subsist on a very small stipend, government stipend, while the Kraton Yogyakarta was able to maintain its status. It had a Daerah Istimewa, special district that was deemed a certain a special autonomous zone with its land holdings and property income intact. Solo struggled. It had to choose between, had to choose very carefully what it spent its money on. In 1985, a fire swept through the inner heart of the Kraton. It was a devastating blow, and an outpouring of sympathy and support allowed them to rebuild the inner buildings of the palace. The engineer, Suwono, was sent in, the government engineer was sent in to rebuild the palace in a few months out of concrete. And he was startled to find all of the things that I had been finding. He was working in the 80s, I came in the 90s, but he said he basically reached the conclusion that rebuilding a palace is not something that happens every day. We should probably follow the religious practices. And so the four central pillars of the most important joglo, through which is the umbilical cord, the belly button of the universe, those four central pillars were cut from four sacred trees in four sacred forests, north, south, east, and west, after all night, all day, for weeks and weeks, vigil meditation by priests, until the signs came down that it was okay to harvest these trees. The golden nail, pounded by His Royal Highness the Sinoon, into the base of these four central pillars. Then a weird thing happened. About the time that I arrived in Solo in 1991, I was asking around the local university, Gajah Mada University in Jogja, and they said, yes, we have a lot of information about the Kraton. As a matter of fact, we are developing a plan for the conservation, quote unquote, the historic preservation of the Kraton. You'll be excited to know that we are using the United States model of colonial Williamsburg. And they very excitedly described to me that the royal family would all move out of the palace would be refurbished and renewed and made, the buildings that were in horrible repair would all be repaired and polished and very nicely done. And every part of the palace would be repurposed for tourists, and actors would be hired to pretend that they were the royal family. And so visitors would come in, it would be like colonial Williamsburg or Sturbridge Village, or these open air museums. And they were very excited to share this idea with me, and they didn't seem to notice the mounting horror as the blood rushed to my head and burst. Long story short, given how much time we have, when three of the princesses went on a hunger strike in protest of this plan, I worked with them and their siblings to develop a counter proposal. I had been working with college students at the local university to document, very carefully measure and draw the buildings of the palace, which eventually resulted in this depiction that was published in the the Indonesian Archipelago Encyclopedia of Heritage series, this depiction of the Karaton Surakarta, based on the drawings that we were able to assemble. And other drawings where we were proposing the reconstruction of the last piece of the Kraton that was lost to the fire, the grand dining hall. We got a grant to do official documentation of this pavilion that we saw in the cannon cleaning ceremony. We were able to do very careful drawings, and based on a lot of this work, we were able to apply for first a Getty grant And eventually we received an Aga Khan grant for the restoration of the buildings as an alternative to the historic preservation plan that had been hatched by Gajah Mada University and eventually abandoned when opposition, protests from the local university students, and opposition from within the royal family itself caused Upave, the Minister of Tourism and Culture, to pull back on his plans for killing the Kraton as the first step in bringing it back to life with actors. And so with the help of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, we worked with Pa Asmo, the royal architect, master builder, priest, in the restoration of many of the buildings, including the Panggung Songgobuwono, the tower that plays such an important role each year with the coronation. And so this is the part where the buildings get fixed up, but not just with an outside team. We insisted, first and foremost, that the royal family themselves were the owners of this project, that the king himself was the owner of this project. We, the technical experts, could make our studies and say, this is what Pakubuwana X did in 1846. This is the color he had through the paint analysis, and these are the materials he used. But he's not the king now. Your grandfather is dead. You're the king. If you tell us to paint it pink or purple, we will paint it pink or purple. You're the king. And that was only possible because of a recognition that the buildings themselves have no or not much inherent value, that it's the practices that continuously renew the meaning of the buildings that make the buildings meaningful. And these practices, at the heart of these religious practices, is the head of the Kajawan religion, Zinun. And so far be it from us to undermine the source of value. And so this is a radical reinterpretation of the practices of historic preservation, thus the interest that the different universities asking me to give lectures about this took in it, that the role of living cultures. Now the larger premise of this, the title of this talk is based on, is that there is a reflexive relationship between the physical buildings, the spaces within and between the physical buildings, and the practices that occur within those physical buildings. And so that the spaces are charged by these ceremonies and these rituals, and that these spaces are charged with the performing arts, the Bedoyo Ketawang, all of these, even the brass band, God bless them, that these are the events that actually produce the buildings. The buildings are important, but in and of themselves, they might as well either be allowed to decay into nothing or encased in plastic and preserved as a dead museum of a bygone era. But the real value of these buildings, the real value of the Kraton itself is only there because the royal family was not displaced, was not moved out. It's only there because the royal family, in the financial hardship of the post-war period, instead of repairing the buildings, for better or worse, they thought that their money was better spent keeping the rituals going. And so the cycle of Grebek, Malam Satu Soro, Jumana Dalam, all of these, the offerings every Wednesday night, that all of these cycles of religious practices ensure the value and the meaning of the buildings, even as the buildings decay and in some cases fall down. And so this is a reflexive relationship between the arts and the physical and the non-physical, as Indonesians love to characterize things. And so why don't we stop there? I think that's 42 minutes, and you're probably ready for a break.
Thank you, Robert. It was wonderful. You're open for some questions and answers?
Please.
All right. We have a few questions actually already in the chat.
Okay.
And if anybody would like to ask any additional questions, please put your name in the chat box. You can put your question in the chat box if you want, or just put your name and I can call on you to ask your question. So let's see, what was the first question here? Let me scroll up here. Oh yeah, so the first question is from Wanda Listiani from ESBE Bandung, Indonesia. So she said, so interesting, Professor Robert. What do you think about intervention, adaptive reuse, and heritage context at Mangkunagaran Palace and Kraton Surakarta?
I noticed that question was asked about 15 minutes ago.
Yeah.
As my presentation hopefully made clear, that adaptive reuse of buildings in the United States, where the culture that produced the original physical fabric is gone. And adaptive reuse, have at it. Whatever you can do to justify the ongoing existence of this this armature of memory, this thing that we can see in our landscape as a physical manifestation of a bygone era that might otherwise, its values and its economic activities, its history, might otherwise be forgotten. Instead, it's great if you can keep these artifacts alive and present in our landscapes. It's very different if you're talking about living traditions. As I argued when I was arguing against dislocating the royal family out of the Kraton, I said to my good friends at Gajah Mada University, if we in the United States had the opportunity to support the ongoing practices of the Congregational Church in Williamsburg, Virginia, whose minister was a descendant of the Congregational Church 200 years earlier, we would have done anything in our power to keep that going, because that is the greatest value. It makes no sense to kill a living culture in order to bring it back to life. And so the Mangkunagara is much more comfortable negotiating with outside forces than the Sinun, the current Pakubuwana XIII. And so I would say that it is contingent. The adaptive reuse of these historic monuments are contingent on the living cultures, on the ongoing respect of the living cultures that are the source of meaning, the source of value. That we need to identify what is the source of value in these artifacts, and then make sure that we are not undermining that source or diminishing that source of value in the process of what we do with it in the present age. I hope that works for you.
Thank you, Robert. So, Robert, are you all set with sharing slides? You're all done?
I have some more. I have a client who I designed a house for that I'm ready to, it's in Solo. It happens to be my ex-girlfriend who now lives in Solo. I stayed in touch with her, and a few years ago she asked if I could help her design a house for her and her husband.
Oh, okay, cool. I understand now. So do you want to take some more questions and then we can go to those slides perhaps?
Sure.
Well, why don't let's stop sharing for just a second then.
Okay. Oh, that's me.
Got it. So next question is from Richard Wallace. If you would like to jump in, Richard.
Hi, Richard.
Hi, Bob. I have a question about the tower when the Sultan goes up ostensibly to meditate and conjoin with the Nyai Roro Kidul. Who is, you mentioned a priest. What type of priest or official is that who accompanies him up there?
Doesn't accompany him, but the chamber must be prepared. And so anyone entering the chamber to prepare it, it's extremely limited, and it's important that it be limited to the Sinun and one other. I'm not actually sure if that responsibility changes hands over the years, or but it.
So it's not necessarily a ritual specialist.
Not necessarily. I think
Okay.
the room is filled with offerings and incense, of course, and the royal bed chamber is prepared. So I'm told.
Okay, thank you so much, Bob.
You bet.
Okay, next we have Ed Luna. Ed, would you like to jump in with your question? There he is. Let me unmute you, Ed. There you go.
Okay, I don't know if I'm sort of visible on the screen, but so my question was this. So during the reconstruction of the Kraton Solo after the fire, now were measurement details still done with body part based measurements? So you find similar practices, let's say with Balinese undagi carpenters, and I'm sure elsewhere in the Austronesian speaking world. So I was just wondering if people did they still base their measurements on body parts? And yeah, so if you had any comments on that.
It is true. I've done work in Bali, so I'm familiar with that. And very often we find in Bali an excellent basis for understanding what was once the practice in Java. And in this case, Engineer Suwono, who was the engineer put in charge of the reconstruction of the palace, he did manage to switch gears away from his technocratic approach of rebuilding the palace in concrete. And thank God that he decided to follow, to a large extent, the practices of the Kraton tradition. But in that regard, I distinctly recall seeing the measured drawings for the reconstruction of the Kraton after the 1985 fire. And everything was dimensioned in centimeters, rounded, 20, 24. It did not suggest that this was based on the hand dimension or other bodily dimensions of Pakubuwana XII.
Thank you.
Next we have- oh yes, Pak Sumarsam.
Yes, I have a hard time to write down on the chat.
No problem.
Mas Bob, thank you for all things that you gave us a lot of information about the Kraton. And I was told that you have unrestricted space to observe the whole Kraton except the Kamar Harem.
The Kaputran.
Kaputran.
That is true. I've never been in the Kaputran, but I think I've been to most other places.
Yeah, but my real question is, your talk seemed to give an impression that all of the syncretisms, the Hindu, Buddhist, Islam, Java, nationalism, all seems to be very well received and happy fusions. But do you, can you find any idiosyncratic about the Kraton? I'm thinking of this Clifford Geertz trope of that cultural artifact is historically constructed, socially maintained, and individually applied. And historically constructed is okay, but what about socially maintained and individually applied? That will be a good discussion about something like idiosyncratic. I'm thinking of the Candang Balong, the singer and the clowns who sings very weird stuff in accompanying for the shrimpy, which is the most refined dance. But at the same time, that Candang Balong, at least historically, was outside of the Kraton. He was a kermo, a pimp. So, do you have any of that idiosyncratic story instead of happy fusion only?
Well, two stories. The first story revolves around my naive. I was trained as an architect, not an anthropologist, and the second handicap I arrived with is that I was from the United States, and I thought I understood the world, typical American. And I was very, very anxious and very disturbed when I would ask one person, what's the meaning of this decorative motif? It has 8 sides. And they would explain, well, 8 is a sacred number in Islam, and the Prophet lived 8 times 8 years, and a walu, just on and on and on about Islam, Islam, Islam. This column is all about Islam. It's obvious, 8 sides, Islam. And then I would, as a good researcher, I was learning, oh yeah, you need to confirm. So I would ask a second informant. And he would say, well, you'll notice that there's this flower at the bottom, and it's a symbol of birth. And then as you rise up the column, it goes to this is the middle of life. And then at the top, it's the symbol of death and returning to the heavens. And it faces the east, so which is the rising sun of Hinduism. And it was Hindu, 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 Hindu. And so I would go to a third, who was my very good friend, Prince Dipo Kusumo, and I would say, Gusti Dipo, which one of them is lying and which one of them is telling me the truth? And he would very sagely and quietly and patiently say, why does one have to be true and the other not true? And once I recovered from that trauma of multiple truths and began to embrace it, I realized that the Kraton, and of course, Nancy Florida, John Pemberton, the Kraton was postmodern before it was modern. Java was a postmodern culture before it was a modern culture. And complexity and there is no single truth, of course. It's only text. It's all text. Text on top of text on top of text. But one of my favorite versions of this is the one that you mentioned, where I was startled, like, who is this woman? She's running around pushing the offerings as if to someone control her. Why isn't someone stopping her? She's trying to knock over the offerings. And again, patiently explained to me that if there is not someone disrupting the order, then the gods will feel obligated to disrupt it on their own. So unless we introduce and embrace, as difficult as it is, whether it's a pimp or a clown or whomever, if there's not something making us profoundly uncomfortable, then we're leaving ourselves open. We're leaving ourselves at great risk that the gods will disrupt. If we don't disrupt, if we don't embrace the disruption from within, disruption will come from without, and you won't like it. Is that?
Thank you. Very good.
Okay, Chris Miller has a question.
Thank you, sir.
Oh, hello, Seni Tari. I'm sorry. Oh, Hera Hafia, you have a question?
Yeah.
Sure.
Excuse me, sir. I am Hera Hafianti, ISB Bandung student. Permission to ask, in the celebration of the Malam Satu Suro in the Karaton Surakarta, is it a manifestation of religion in the form of culture? Thank you, sir.
Wow. Well, as my friends in the Kraton would answer, is it a manifestation of religion in terms of culture? Why categorize it? So what is the usefulness of these categories? Is it religious? Yes. Is it cultural? Yes. Is it not one? You know, it's the kind of categorization that runs against the grain of the evidence itself. The understanding of these things do not benefit. They do not weather well. They do not enjoy being categorized as just culture, just religion, just economics, just politics. Hopefully, as we move from the 20th century into something else, we have a greater capacity to navigate the complexities that might otherwise be lost by those simplifications that are useful up to a point, and then at a certain point, it's best to embrace the complexity of beyond those boundaries. I hope that is okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Chris. You are muted.
You're muted, Chris.
Okay, I'll unmute. And can you hear me? Great. So yeah, I was really curious. I mean, I'm kind of floored that I hadn't asked you more about this work. It's totally fascinating. I mean, I've known you for so long, but you know, I knew that you did this work. But yeah, so it's fantastic to finally get this window into it. I just wish I'd asked sooner, earlier. But anyway, here we are. I was really curious what the current state of affairs is, and with the dispute over succession that happened, and I don't know if that's too touchy a subject to kind of address, or but if not, yeah, I'm curious if you could say anything about that.
Well, it was hotly contested. There were physical barricades involved in the physical palace, where openings were walled up and no access. It was an absolute fortress situation. It went on for years. And at a certain point, the the sectors of the family, the segments of the family that were not occupying the Kraton relinquished the contestation just so things could move on. And so at this point, officially, everything is settled, and Pakubuwana XIII is the Sinun. Beyond that, there are accusations of criminal activity, and beyond that, that's the point at which, you know, I just emotionally and intellect, I just, you know, boom, I'm not interested in knowing. I would rather not know the extent to which I would prefer just to not know. So let's leave
Fair
it.
enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
You bet. Thank you, Chris. It's really great to see so many old friends here. It feels like a bit of a reunion. I'm very grateful for the turnout.
We have Garrett Cam next with a question.
Yeah, I don't have my video on, but I'm curious if it was true that the only structure that survived the fire was the tower, and that itself, it's based on a Dutch windmill without the blades, and in itself it is also a great gallery that links to the monas to open your talk with. If you could say a little bit more about that. Thanks.
Yeah, I've heard the Dutch windmill comparison. It was built in 1745 at a time when the Dutch were the colonial dominant forces and were in alliance and were a major motivating force of the transfer of the Kraton from Kartasura in a procession to Surakarta. So the Dutch were absolutely embedded in the process of the reconstruction of the new palace in Surakarta in 1745. And so, but it really starts and ends with kind of a physical similarity. There's no equivalent series of balconies in a Dutch windmill. A Dutch windmill is a very specific thing. You know, maybe for structural convenience, there are some similarities, but the limitations of construction in 1745 may account for those similarities. The much more interesting aspect of your excellent question is the fire. The fire alternately is like many things in the Kraton, like many things associated with the Kraton. If one wishes to find a mundane explanation, it's available. Old wiring caused a short and a fire. Old wood buildings with faulty wiring, with bad maintenance, fires are inevitable. At the same time, there's nothing contradictory between a fire being started from faulty wire and disfavor, having appeared to be an unfavorable position in relationship to the forces of the universe. It's said that there's nothing more devastating to a Javanese noble than to have his house burned down. And so it was taken, I'm confident that both of these stories are embraced in the way that Javanese multiple readings are consistently embraced elsewhere. The interesting thing about the fire swept through the core of the palace, and according to Nancy Florida and others and Tim Behrens and others who were doing work at the time, that not only did the library not suffer damage, but the wall of the library did not even have the dark damage from smoke. It was a pristine white wall, whereas everything up to that wall was burnt down to ash. And so, the Panggung Sungawono, being across from the Karaton courtyard, was at a bit of a remove. I'm not sure if there was any, whether that was unexpected that it didn't burn down itself. But the story that has been repeated over and over to me over the years is about the library and how amazing it is that that precious repository of Javanese literature was unharmed.
Garrett, I think you're muted still. Thank you. Oh. All set, Garrett?
Hey, I only if you want to comment more, if it's anything with the Lingga-Yoni relationship and the fact that the tower was the place where the Sinohon consummated his relationship with Ratu Kidul, and the fact that he did not show up on that night that led to the fire. I mean, there's all the mystical relationships and explanations, and if you want to comment more on that.
Well, Garrett, I really appreciate it.
Yoni.
I have never heard that explanation that he failed to show up. I was not aware.
Yeah, he did not show up, and she was a very upset Queen of the South, and showed her anger and displeasure by burning down most of the palace. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
I really want to chime in here because Garrett just mentioned about the Panggung Songgobuwono, and still the question that I had before, whether you can think of the syncretism is always a result in heavy fusion, or maybe there's an idiosyncratic syncretism. The Panggung Buwono, as I understand it, every Thursday evening they play European string ensemble every Thursday evening. And how can that be? And they play polkas and waltzes and quadrille. So that's, to me, is a really arbitrary syncretism. Well, I don't know. I'm not judging things, but
I would love to read your article under the title
yes, it's in my book.
Oh, is it? Is the chapter called the idiosyncratic syncretic?
No. There's my just my recent terminology.
Well, it makes for a good title. I leave it to you. I will not use it. Everyone here heard it from you, so no one can use that great title. It's a great thesis, idiosyncratic syncretic.
Can I just ask another question?
Yeah.
I noticed on the Gunungan in Solo they had the Indonesian flags, and then in Jogja they never put the Indonesian flags on their Gunungan. Yet Jogja was more key in the Republic of Indonesia, the founding and the revolution, and Surakarta was not. So why this sort of a switcheroo of the symbolism of the flags, Indonesian national flag on the Gunungan?
Excellent question. I do not know. if you ask the people at the Karaton Surakarta, they will tell you that this is a total miscarriage of justice, that that behind the scenes, at least, the members of the Karaton Surakarta, the royal family, were at the core of the resistance and the revolutionary movement, is what the members of the Karaton Surakarta will claim when asked.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
And I love your idea about the human interacting and making disturbances during rituals. They also have the Danidanan, the crazy people who are always there at weddings and major ceremonies to provide comic relief, but also to disrupt, intentionally disrupt. Yeah, excellent observation.
Well, it's
Thanks.
more of just stories that have been told to me, and helped me be more tolerant of the drunk uncle at the wedding, that maybe he's performing a very important role.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a question here that I'm going to read for Kitsi, since it's a little early there still. So I'm going to read her question for her. So Kitsi wants to know, what do you think about the initiative and activism of the palaces in Jogja to get on YouTube with all their ceremonies, full recordings open to all, MCs explaining everything in Indonesian to the uninitiated, etc. Solo Kraton and Mangkunegaran seem completely uninterested in such promotion. What is your opinion on that? A good thing the ceremonies are kept obscure and private, or going to be the demise, their demise?
Well, I suspect my judgment is not really of any value, or as much of a value as the historic pattern where the Mangkunegaran throughout the colonial period was the go-to royal house that embraced the Dutch, that prepared their own cultural documentation and their own cultural presentations. They appear to be very self-consciously, John Pemberton writes about this very beautifully and entertainingly, that the Mangkunegaran appears to be fully prepared for Dutch consumption. They look at how Dutch ethnographers interpret the world, and the Mangkunegaran cultural producers produce their cultural, and they package their cultural content for consumption by the Dutch ethnographers. And that's, you all know the evidence of this better than I, of Western notation making its way into Gamelan. How did that happen? So at the same time, almost in response to the Mangkunegarans presenting Javanese culture on a silver Dutch Baroque engraved platter, the Kraton always seemed to have a sense of the importance of eccentricity, of being inaccessible, of being unpredictable, about being going against the grain of expectations. And it's something that has infuriated generation after generation of people from the West who would try to understand the Kraton and engage the Kraton, that they seem to constantly undermine their own position. They snatch defeat from success. I can't tell you how many times I lined up grant funding for this or that with total support of the Sinuhun, only to have him rejected in the final analysis, right at the last minute, or something like that, various degrees, large and small, up to and including the Aga Khan Award for Architecture ceremony, which had some really bizarre events happen during the ceremony itself. So this seems to be a time-honored tradition of not catering to fitting well, working and playing well with others. It's almost a high art form, whether it's deliberate or not, I don't know, but the pattern is there.
Thank you. That was fascinating. We have Mark Perlman up next with a question.
Hi, Mark.
Bob, so great to see you. And yes, thank you. Lovely to see your slides and hear the story. Brings up a lot of memories and some several thoughts. I mean, especially about the fire, the 1985 fire. I arrived in Solo in February of 1984, and I remember that time, and I also remember the electrical wiring, and that story as the cause of the fire made a lot of sense to me, because Solo apparently had originally been wired for 110 volts, but I don't know when, but certainly by the time I got there, it had converted to 220 volts. But the wires in the Kraton had never been replaced. And almost as soon as I got there in 84, I was only there a few months, and a filmmaking team from Northern California came through. Basically just these two guys, I think. And they had a grant to document the Titinggalan Jumenengan, the annual commemoration of the coronation, including the Bedoya Ketawang. And they needed help with, when they discovered, what it all involved, they started asking around for help, because it was just the two of them. And then, they heard that, oh, and then there's this event the night before. And then, during the event, while all the bupatis are streaming, are filing in, there's music in this little pavilion and there's music there. And they couldn't be everywhere at once. And so they asked, does somebody have a good tape recorder? And somehow or other they found me, and I volunteered, of course, to help to record, I think it was Mongang, in one of the, you will know what it was. It was a small pavilion right as you enter.
Okay,
yes, that was it.
Place of waiting for the king.
Right, thank you. And so I had to walk barefoot to place my microphone in front of the instruments over the batshit, and something I'll never forget. But after the filming, when I was also recording in the Sasono Ondorawino, which was a thrill. After the event, I gave them, the recordings, and I said, so when will this be ready? And they said, we don't know. We have to raise money for the post-production. I said, you came here, without any money for the post-production, just for the filming? And they said, no, we were, we had it all. We got $5,000. But then once we got here, we were told that it was expected that we'd make a contribution to the palace as a sign of gratitude for permission to document it. And we asked them what would be an appropriate gift. And they said, what's your budget? And we said $5,000. And they said, that will be sufficient. So they used all of their budget, all of their production budget, and had to go back and raise more funds. And to this day, I have never heard of this film being released. And it must be, if the film footage still exists, it would be priceless. And it would be probably important for maybe architectural documentation as well, because it would be the last document, of that structure before the fire.
Absolutely.
Do you have any idea of who those people were or what happened to it?
Well, I'd be interested in anything you have on Ondrawino, because that was a big mystery to me. We were always talking about rebuilding that last structure that was never rebuilt after the 85 fire. It was eventually rebuilt around 1996, but very disappointed in the outcome. So I'm curious about Ondrawino and if you have any photos of that. The Bedoyo Katawang specifically is at the center of stories after story of attempts to record it, attempts to film it, that mysteriously resulted in technical difficulties. Like the electrical wiring of the fire, the film emulsion was faulty, or it got damaged during processing. But year after year, attempts to film, even after permission was given for the filming of the Bedoyo Katawang, the year after year, there was nothing to show for it, despite multiple attempts, until I believe it was around 1998 or 99, when my friend, a Balinese filmmaker who befriended the Sinoon, became very close friends with him, and made this documentary film. Part of this documentary film is the first footage in video of the Bedoyo Katawang that was recorded at that time.
I have a similar story in terms of audio recording, because when I first went to Solo in 1981, I was with a friend who was, I cannot remember why exactly, particularly interested in the music for the Bedoyo Katawang. And I, for some reason, was not interested in it and not planning to record it, maybe in part just not wanting to, kind of deal with everything involved with it. But as a favor, I went to the head of the music department at the time, Prabu Winoto, and said, at the next rehearsal, is it okay if I make an audio recording of the rehearsal? And he said, sure. So I showed up with my little 1-point stereo microphone and, brought it out. And one of the musicians, and I think probably Winoto wasn't there, but one of the musicians said to me, oh, you can't record the Bedoyo Katawang. And I said, well, I'm just as happy not to, but I actually asked permission, and probably Winoto said it was all right. And he kind of wavered a bit, and then he said, well, the Bedoyo Katawang doesn't want to be recorded. And but then we kind of came to an agreement. He said, okay, put out your microphone and press record, and and see if there's any sound on your tape at the end. And I said, fine. So it did record, but then I gave the recording to my friend and didn't keep a copy. But so there's a document there from 1981.
Excellent. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I always received these tales with some suspicion, but you can probably tell that I'm less interested in the factual reality. It's fascinating in and of itself that these stories are told with such confidence and with such certainty. So it's I mean that's a reference point in and of itself. Kitsi, you should tell the story that you just
Yes.
wrote in the chat.
Yeah, Kitsi, do you want to jump in with that story real quick before we move on?
Sure. So, you know, I'm thanks, Bob. This is truly fascinating. I'm embarrassed to say I feel kind of like what Chris Miller said. I should have known so much more of the specifics of your work. I think I knew maybe more than Chris, but I really learned a lot today. So this is inspiring. Yeah, I was given a copy of a handwritten copy of the hand-copied Bedoyo Katawang vocal notation from an Abdi Dalam, and a lot of people here know who this person is, but I won't say their name as they may have get in trouble for that. But no pronouns either. So this person gave it to me, and gave me very specific instructions on 3 different occasions, repeated them when they came to my house. This is, you have to store it horizontally, don't store it vertically in a bookcase. It has to be this high, at least from the ground. It has to be in a closed up cupboard, very, very specific. And I found the right place for it. And I was living in Soniten at the time, a neighborhood of the Kraton, Soniten, and I didn't move. It wasn't lost in a move or anything. I didn't move, and I don't know what to say. 10 years later, I went to look at it. I was studying Sindanan, and I got curious again, kind of again like Mark. At first, I never really thought much about it, but 10 years later, I went to look for it. It wasn't there. That's all I can say. Don't know. So thank you. Thanks, Bob.
I have a question. I'm not sure how many more questions you want to take, Robert.
Well, I have to keep up with the competition unless I'll give up when we hit 2 hours and 43 minutes.
I think the longest lecture was almost 3.5 hours. So we got some time to go here.
I don't have to beat that one.
Okay. So I would like to know a little bit more about the actual historical preservation aspect of the work you did. So did you find any particular difficulties when you were restoring some of these structures in terms of materials or knowledge, in terms of how to recreate some of these things from a technical level? And were there any sort of contentious or particularly interesting parts of the restoration preservation process that you'd like to share?
Yes, there were. Thank you for asking. The first challenge was I got to know how previous similar engagements with outside institutions had been experienced by the royal family. More or less, the simple formula was the outsider connects with one person or one what's the right word? One segment of the royal family, one faction of the royal family and that faction would use this outside connection as a power play for some advantage over the other factions of the royal family. The other characteristic of outside engagements were that the Japanese, when they came in to do their air conditioning of the library in the late 80s, they came in. Gusti Pugard, I think, was their faction connection, and these a small army of Japanese technicians came in, whoosh, air conditioning, glass, it was done, beautiful, and then off they go, they're gone, without a real transfer of understanding about maintaining and why, and worries about condensation, where the cold meets the humid. But more seriously than that, the confirmation of the royal family's worst fears, that they could not be trusted, they could not manage something like this, that they could not execute the repair and improvement of their own palace. And so there was every time somebody came in from the outside and added value, there was, in terms of the physical, there was a tremendous loss of value in terms of the non-physical. And so part of the reason it took me 4 years of negotiations with the royal family is I said, what good is it for us to come in and do something good that ultimately does something bad? It's just buildings, to hell with the buildings. Let the buildings die. I'm not going to be a party to reducing the carrying capacity of the non-physical palace. I'm not interested in working with you, Gusti Dipokusumo, and your faction. I will do this on the condition that we have a gathering of all your brothers and sisters. So I'm quite proud, maybe better than, the buildings have not fared well, but we got the first ever, it was the first time, I was told later, that this is the first time that this group had ever gotten together in anything but a religious capacity, that we had 34 of the 36 princes and princesses. And we had a meeting. We pitched the idea of holding the Aga Khan Award for Architecture ceremony in the Kraton in 1995. There was discussion about what was important to different people. And yes, the different factions expressed themselves contentiously against each other, but at least they were talking about this one thing in the same room, or in the same courtyard. And so that was the biggest struggle to overcome, the biggest barrier to overcome. The second thing is we didn't want to bring in technicians from Jakarta. We didn't want to bring them in from Tokyo, Hong Kong, Jakarta, LA. We wanted to revive the craftsman culture, the community of craftsmen that had inherited the responsibilities for the decorative arts of the Kraton. It turns out they, without a lot of work and funding to do work in the Kraton, they were working on Cenderamata or Wayang out in the alun-alun north. And then every once in a while, the Hilton Hotel in Jakarta would fly them there to redo the lobby in true Kejawan, authentic Kejawan style. So it was really wonderful to bring them from all of that into the Kraton to do these decorative arts that they had inherited from their parents. And then the challenge for me is they said, okay, here we go. I said, well, what are you going to use to fill all these cracks? And they said, oh, we use Bondo. And I said, no, you can't use Bondo. Bondo is for cars, auto body. Bondo is good for cars because it doesn't budge with humidity or temperature. It's like steel. So Bondo is excellent for cars. You're not going to use Bondo on these buildings. And they said, oh no, we use Bondo. That's what we do. That's what we're going to do. And I was like, I don't know. But it caused a crisis for me personally. I was like, I know that Bondo is not going to work. Oh, but I can't say it because I'm so committed to, leaving it in their hands. So I said, okay, Bondo, let's go, let's see it. And they used Bondo, and I came back in 2000, my wife, our newborn child, we were in Bandung for a year at ITB, and I came for Gusti Mung's wedding, and all the Bondo work that had been done 5 years earlier was perfect. No cracks. It was perfect. So I guess my wood technology training in New England was not an appropriate match to the constant high humidity of Java that was the right thing to do.
Cool, thank you. Any last questions here for Robert? You can jump in now if you'd like to ask a question before we move on to the final slides here. Oh, actually, Garrett has some information here. It says Alex D. Mentioned that a professional TV producer filmed the entire Bedoya Katawang, but the tapes were not playable. So they were sent to Japan. Nothing was on them, so they were returned. One day the images suddenly reappeared and the producer died unexpectedly soon after. It's incredible.
Yeah.
Wow, thank you for that update, Garrett. Yeah, so cool. So yeah, I don't see any more questions coming in. So why don't we jump?
I have a question.
Oh, who's that?
It's Wayne. I don't have my video. Wayne Forrest.
Jump on.
Yeah. Hi, Bob. Just a quick question, Bob. Can you connect? Are there ongoing connections between the Indonesian architectural schools and these kinds of preservation projects? Has anything advanced since the time period when you were working on all this, so that there are other institutional connections for the future?
Well, it's interesting. When I arrived in Java, my line explaining my whiteness and why I was here, so I'm really interested in the history of Javanese architecture and its cities. And the typical response was, well, why did you come here? You should have gone to the Netherlands. And it turned out to be the case that there were only a handful of people with any interest in this old stuff. The local university, Universitas 11 Maret, could not get anyone interested until I said, I will pay you to come with me and measure these places. That was the limit of the interest. It was really shocking. I was thrilled when I found out that there was a Society of Indonesian Architects, architectural historians, and I've stayed in touch with them. They're not that interested in the Kratons, certainly not the Kraton Solo. They just celebrated their 30th anniversary of their founding, and they invited me to be, I was thrilled, they invited me to be their inaugural keynote speaker in a series of 7 lectures. But I knew they had no interest in the Kraton. I never once mentioned the Kraton. I talked instead about Dutch colonial architectural history. And then because I didn't want to get into contemporary practice in Indonesia, and my least favorite story, which is my least favorite topic, which is how architecture produces the national identity of Indonesia. So I wanted to avoid that at all costs. So I talked about bamboo, and I talked about the Anthropocene and the global climate emergency, and how the Subak system in Bali, the traditional religious system that about rice growing, outperformed the Green Revolution, and maybe some of these bamboo traditions that were outlawed by the Dutch could be revitalized, and people could build and live in bamboo once again. So I knew that the audience was not interested in the Kraton, any of these things. And we had an active question and answering session. They know that I worked for 4 years on the Kraton. Many of them came to the Aga Khan Award for Architecture ceremony. Nobody asked the question. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody is interested in this. There is a woman, there are a couple, the place where there's interest is in the Netherlands. And there's one researcher, who I think is in England, who is interested. Helene Nyoto has taken an interest. I'm not aware of any interest coming from Indonesia itself.
Cool. I have one more question. Before I ask the question, though, I'm just going to mention that we've gotten a couple of donations for the Bronze Campaign during this lecture. So I'm going to put the link again in the chat box here for people to donate to Nusantara Arts getting a bronze gamelan. If you would do that, that would make our generation here in Buffalo. We'd be so happy. So thank you for those who have donated so far. One question I have is like something, actually, I think I sent an email to the gamelan list a few years ago. And when I first started my group here, I was like, what makes the best, from an acoustical standpoint for the gamelan music? What makes a great space for a gamelan? How can we recreate a good sounding space, not in Java, not in actual joglo or pendopo, because we have such different structures. A lot of gamelan that I know in the United States are in church basements or in closets in universities, or some places like at Wesleyan, they have a wonderful space for their gamelan there. But sort of a 2-for-1 question here. What can be done to a space to make it more acoustically friendly to gamelan? And secondary question, do you notice any architecture emulating the style of these structures, joglo or pendopo structures or kraton type structures in any architecture outside of Indonesia, people looking to there for inspiration?
Wow. 2 big questions. There is a very interesting study of how Mozart's music changed when his church was renovated, that the reverberation time changed, and suddenly the constant reference to the tonic of the old long reverberation time was no longer something that the building required of Mozart's music. And when the church was renovated, the reverberation time is believed to have gone way down. And so shifting tonal genres, I'm not saying the right words, and I apologize to all the people who know what the right words are. But the shorter reverberation time was related. I'm not saying I'm not a big fan of cause and effect. I am a big fan of reflexive relationships. So the reflexive relationship between Mozart's tonality, his tonal strategies, and the reverberation period of his church is a reflexive relationship. And when the church changed, his music changed. And this is a really wonderful demonstration of the kind of relationship between building and music that can exist. I'm not aware of any similar study for gamelan and joglos, pendopos. The the thing that I really, my personal preference is gamelan is such a completely different performance practice where people are joking, laughing, clinking glasses, falling asleep, walking out for a smoke, people coming different distances towards or away from the joglo. I would say the number one important relationship is that people hear the gamelan in the distance. Like, this is one of the magical things that on a hot night, or it's just starting to cool down, pedaling through the gangs on a becak, when you're getting closer, you hear it. I wouldn't go so far as to say you have to have low quality amplification and megaphones to the neighborhood. But I do feel that the outdoorsness, the casual, the flexibility, the all-nightness of it, that all of these are parts of the magic of the experience, that it's just not the same when we sit properly with our hands folded in the concert hall. There's always something missing in that experience. So that's the first question. Is that the first question? The next one is, do people ever emulate the joglo or other aspects of this architecture beyond Indonesia? The closest story that I'm aware of, and this is one of my favorite things that I've published about, is a Dutch architect who in 1923 on a stage in Bandung, there was a debate between Schumacher and Pont. Schumacher was saying the great cultures of the Dutch Indies are dead. The great architectures are Borobudur, Prambanan, Dieng Plateau. They're preserved in stone. The appropriate ethical policy, forward-looking Dutch Indish style architecture, the Indies style architecture that is essential to the justification for the ongoing Dutch colonial rule of the Dutch Indies. The architecture, the only proper architecture, is one that celebrates these great civilizations of Hindu Buddhism, of Prambanan and Borobudur. And on the other side, Pont, who was married to a Javanese woman, was a big fan of Wayang and Gamelan and Wayang Wong. He said, no, the wooden architecture may not last long, but it has been glorified and celebrated in the carvings on the walls of Borobudur and other of these temples. This is a profound and great architecture. In response, Schumacher said, but wait, they don't even know how structures work. When they put their rafters, up, they don't understand that rafters are efficient when they're oriented in this direction. They don't flex. They put them like this, where they bend. Total ignorance of how rafters work, of how physics works. So Pont basically lost the debate. He went off and studied the buildings. One of the buildings he studied was the one that you saw a picture of me climbing into the rafters, where the rafter tails hang and the flex that the roof had like this, by hanging the lower roof off to the rafter tail, it lifts it up and compensates. And so there's this dynamic relationship of the shape of the roof because of these forces. So he realized, in part, looking at that building in the palace in the Karaton Surakarta, that not only was this not a strategy, not only was this ignorance, this was a very sophisticated strategy of dynamic structural forces. And he went on for the next 15 years before the Japanese invaded, he experimented with using cables to hang clay tile roofs and to exaggerate this play of dynamic forces. He never built it outside of Indonesia, as far as I know, but there's a chapel, the Kosorang Chapel in East Java is one of his buildings, and he built several experimental roof structures to test out some of these ideas. But it's something that Frei Otto in Germany, in Kenzo Tange in Japan, that there are these the traditions of tensile structures. I don't think there's any awareness of what Pont was doing in Java, but it's very much of the same type of very sophisticated structural exploration of architectural form.
Thank you. Wayne just asked to clarify, and do you think it has anything to do with earthquake proofness, more earthquake proof perhaps?
Well, that's what Pont certainly believed, that in an earthquake or in high winds, the lateral loads are accommodated by the adjustment of the structure. And that is certainly borne out by the longevity of some of these joglo roofs.
Cool. Thank you very much, Robert. I don't think any other questions popped in here, so maybe we could move on to this next little section of your presentation here.
Sure, this is like let's call it a coda, since you're musicians. That many years later, Kitsi and Wakiti were looking at land for several years. And I just threw these slides in the last few minutes. I just have 3 slides. Well, actually, one's a video. So Kitsi and Wakiti for years were looking for land. They looked at and rejected several parcels. In 2012, I happened to be giving a paper in Jogja. I popped on over to Solo. I was there for less than 24 hours. And I had a very short visit with Kitsi and Wakiti. And we were saying bye. And they were saying, yeah, we have to go. We've got to look at this land. And they said, oh, you should come with us. And I said, sure, let's go. And we went to this piece of land. And I said, you should buy this piece of land. They bought it. And in 2015, I started sketching. My first sketch, it was a very strange piece of, it wasn't quite rectangular, but the thing that I really wanted to do, or given what Kitsi and Wakiti wanted, the things I drew was I wanted to keep at this extreme corner. This is where the cars go. We want to keep them out of the way, keep them from going deep into the lot. Just come off the road and that's it. And in this back corner, at the extreme opposite end, is the archive, the Perpustakaan of all of Kitsi's tapes and notation. Maybe someday the notation, the missing notation, will reappear, and then do everything as an L shape, leaving one corner near the front for a pendopo. Someday a joglo will appear, and we need to be prepared for that. So that was my very first sketch. Some 6 months later, I'm on sketch 6. Throughout, I was trying to preserve these gardens in the back, like the buildings, and this will ring a bell, that buildings, sure, whatever. But the buildings are not the most important thing. The buildings are only as important as the spaces that they produce in between them, within and in between them. And so I very much was conscious of using the buildings as they are used in the Kraton, using the buildings to create open spaces, open gardens, and sure, accommodate all the purposes, all the rooms that they needed, but really the gardens come first. And so I would draw the gardens first and then put the buildings where they needed to be to define the gardens. The breakthrough came moving from the 6th sketch to the 7th, where things suddenly fell into place. There's a place for a joglo. Hopefully it's exactly the right size. Who knows? Be ready for anything. But if I had my way, this is the size I would want. And then create an L-shaped space that would then accommodate all the things and define this garden here at the center of the house. Similarly with the kos, guest rooms, a guest house, as defining this space, outdoor bathrooms, Balinese style, a garden for the cars in the corner, and then a garden within which to set a joglo. And then the dangerous bamboo-y, snaky area of the river, build a wall, stay away from that. And so I was thrilled when Kitsi sent me the link to this, this visitor who wanted to take video of Gamelan's brilliant paintings that are all over the house. And as he moved through the house, he started to notice, he's like, what's behind that? And every time he passed through a door, he'd say, oh, we're here. So he was constantly surprised and this was one of the ones, so what's behind this door? And he's like, oh, we're back at the Pendopo. So this was, for me, a wonderful confirmation of the kind of disorientation that occurs with so many doorways and passageways and very distinct areas that are defined by these gardens. And this was just a couple, 3 days ago. This garden in a rainstorm, this is the garden at the center of the house. Kitsi showing the current state of it in her screen. So it was in putting together this this slideshow and debating whether or not to say, you know, here's what I've been doing since '95. It appears that there are very strong connections, that it's the things that happen in these spaces that are really what charge the architecture. The buildings are just buildings. Someday, this house will become who knows what, but it won't have the same meaning as it does now as a performing arts center in Solo, Ekoloyo. So maybe I'll stop sharing and let Kitsi pin her screen, or you can pin Kitsi's screen.
Yeah, there it is. Kitsi's walking.
I don't know how to do that. Is it pinned? Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So you should, I don't know, you should narrate, Bob, but there's the gate. And then people walk in and they see a lot of people have been to the house, but they see the joglo, which is 225, 26 years old. And it was the only one that was in any kind of state, and that for us to purchase it was the perfect, like the last one after looking at, 40 of them, and yet it fit exactly in that space that Bob left for it. Here's the VIP room, the parlor, the guest room. When important people come here. And then you walk into the kitchen and dining room space.
Which is a knuckle, a pivot point between the front public space and the back private space.
Mm-hmm. So there's the front and then
And the private spaces are all gathered around this inner garden.
Yeah, so you go from the dining room table, the kitchen, but while Pawakiti's cooking, because he's the expert cook, you know, he can look back through here. It's early morning here, so we hadn't opened any of these up yet, but so he can look through here and then it looks straight across to the bedroom. Then we keep walking through the house. And this is our study. But we always have the garden at one side. So we just keep walking around the garden. And then this is the room where I teach online. And right across from it, the garden. And then just keep walking around the garden. And this is what in the video Bob was talking about. Putot kept saying, okay, so wait, what does this door go to? And then we'd open it up and he was like, what, wait, what? So we open up the door and we're back to the joglo. And I'd show you the back garden, but Maswakiti's still asleep. It's so early here, but the the bedroom also opens up into a back garden. So basically, you just walk. I mean, when you're in the house, you're walking around this central garden all the time. When you're outside, it's the Pendopo space that's dominating everything. So I can't even express, Bob. Thank you so. You know, thank you is just not worth it. I don't know how to. You know, it doesn't express it. Don't know how to say thank you for this beautiful place that we exist in every single day now. It's such a gift. It's just perfect. It's beautiful.
Glad it's doing what it's supposed to do.
We love it. We love every single corner of it. And and by the way, guys, there are 2 rooms in the back for rent. So if this COVID era is ever over, both rooms are empty right now. They were full for 2 years, but with COVID, now they're empty. People have gone home. And so when you open up the back, this is the area to go into the rental space. And we have 2 rental rooms. And
Better than Joyu Kusuma. Oh,
You're muted, Kitsy.
You're muted.
oh, sorry, something got pushed. Yeah. So they're just twin. They're both exactly the same. Single rooms with AC and hot water, and and outdoor bathrooms, like Bob was saying. So, yep. So it's open to the. I can't quite get that, but open to the air. So both the rooms are exactly the same, and then they share a kitchen, little kitchenette. So they share that kitchenette. Yeah. And then I mean, they kind of have their own entrance in a way. I mean, it's not that Pakubuwana and I can't come through here, but we usually go through the joglo, and the renters go through this entrance. So the renters, they kind of have their own entrance here.
And that gate for the cars is inspired by the Pintu Joyu Kusuman, just to bring it full circle.
Yep.
Not
So
quite
remember
as
that.
big. Maybe step too far from the Wi-Fi.
Yeah, I think we're losing you, Kitsy, there. Oh, we may have lost.
Okay.
Oh, there she is.
I lost the Wi-Fi when I stepped out there. Yeah. So I don't know if you saw the main gate, but yeah, it's inspired by Joyu Kusuman. Yep. So if you come back to Solo to study, you've got a place to stay, guys. And we have gamelan, wayang, everything. Space for dance. So thanks, Bob.
This commercial message, Kitsy, I think you're going to have to contribute to the Bronze Fund.
We kind of, well, yeah, we kind of are with our legwork, I would say. Yeah, we're the ones finding the gamelan and the wayang for Matt.
Yeah, so yeah, this hasn't really been announced super publicly yet. So, but yeah, Pakubuwana and Kitsy have been super helpful at finding us gamelan. We've actually located a gamelan already outside of Solo, and some wayang puppets, which are actually now in the VIP room, I believe, if I got my okay.
Yes.
Cool. So yeah, we have we're going to be bringing wayang puppets here to Buffalo, so we can do many more wayang performances with Darsono and Midianto, and if we can ever get a grant, maybe somebody from Java. So huge project for us, and we're super appreciative.
Yeah, the wayang set, some of you may know Ki Tomo Pandoyo from Klaten, and his little brother, Mas Gandung, had a wayang set that he had used for much of his performing life so far. I mean, younger brother, he's 50 something. He had a wayang set that he'd used for most of his life and has recently bought a new set, and didn't intend to sell the other set, but decided it would be best to cover his expenses. So it's a Klaten, it's from Tawas, Klaten, and really well balanced sort of mantap, the wayang feel just the right weight and just the right balance in your hands. So they have a beautiful wayang set. And then the gamelan was made in Bakonang, and nobody seems to know by whom it was, but it was made in Bakonang and has been used for many years now by Mas Dian in Japan for his children's groups. And now he wants to build a new space on a rice field across from his place. He wants to build a new joglo and get it and have his other gamelan in that space. And so he wanted to sell the gamelan. So all the deals have all been made. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we're really looking forward to it here. So yeah, actually the structure that we are going to be putting that gamelan in, and this is something I don't know if I've ever told you, Kitsy, is actually in the process of historical preservation currently. It's an old, I believe, Methodist or Episcopalian church that was built in Buffalo around 1880s or so. And it was one of these structures where they had an original chapel, and it was a little bit smaller. Then they built a bigger one around it. And then they built a huge sanctuary even later. And it's a wonderful structure, but it was abandoned like many structures in Buffalo 20, 30 years ago. So it needed some repair. Now, somebody I know, I know through this process, but she purchased this church, for a quite low sum, as you can with old churches in Buffalo. And she's renovating it into a world music, arts, and culture center. And the gamelan is actually going to be like the showpiece of the whole center. We're going to be right in the big sanctuary space under a gigantic stained glass window. Although, that leads me to some of my questions about acoustics, because it can get quite loud in there, so
Right.
you got to figure out how to manage that a little bit. So, but it's going to be a beautiful space.
Beautiful. Yeah, how is it that so many gamelan are in those kind of spaces, right? Like the BVG, I think, got started in a church, right? I think Barry's here, but I think, somehow that's a common space that has room available for rent.
Yeah.
So, any suggestions, Bob, on the acoustics?
Big spaces are better. Open all the doors and windows when you can. And dampening. Fill the hall with people, that'll help.
Yeah, I remember reading something. I remember Wayne Vitale posted a link to his presentation. I read it a few years ago, and he suggested putting in just random objects, I believe, around the area to sort of help with the reflections of the sound. And I think that is, I don't know if it's so similar in Bali and Java, because I know Bali and sort of like the temples, maybe there are more objects around in those situations. I'm not quite sure if it's a similar acoustical setting for Bali and Java. It might be a little different, but
yeah, it's different. It's more open. The ceremonies are often, there's not in a structure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wayne, if you're still there, if you want to jump on with that. I'm not sure if he is here still, but I think I don't think he's here. So yeah, we do appreciate any donations going towards that campaign. But I do want to say, I don't know, I think this has been a wonderful lecture, Robert. Really appreciate having you here, and look forward to keeping track of your work in the future.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's really great to see so many old friends here, and good luck with everything. I'll be following everything you guys do as well.